Welcome to another episode of Draegon Grey's Variety Show. This episode is the beginning of a new series where we will be doing readings from a book club. And the name of the book club is Spine Breakers. So sit back and enjoy this new category. Again, it's the books that we'll be reading from this particular book club, Spine Breakers. So the first book we'll be reading is called Never Let Me Go. And this has been written by Kazuo Ishiguro, sorry. Again, Kazuo Ishiguro. Sit back and enjoy. My name is Kathy H. I'm 31 years old and I've been a carer now for over 11 years. That sounds long enough, I know, but actually, they want me to go on for another 8 months until the end of this year. That'll make it almost exactly 12 years. Now, I know my being a carer so long, some really good carers who've been told to stop after just 2 or 3 years, and I can think of one carer at least who went on for all 14 years despite being a complete waste of space. So I'm not trying to boast, but then I do know for a fact that they've been pleased with my work. And by and large, I have too. My donors have always tended to do much better than expected. Their recovery times have been impressive, and hardly any of them had or have been classified as quote unquote agitated, even for before fourth donation. Okay, maybe I'm boasting now, but it means a lot to me being able to do my work well, especially that bit about my donors staying quote unquote calm. I've developed a kind of instinct around donors. I know when to hang around and comfort them, when to leave them to themselves, when to listen to everything they have to say, and when just to shrug and tell them to snap out of it. Anyway, I am not making any big claims for myself. I know curs working now who are just as good and don't get half the credit. If you're one of them, I can understand how you might get resentful about my bedsit, my car, above all, the way I get to pick and choose who I look after. And or I should say, I'm a Halsham student, which is enough by itself sometimes to get people's backs up. Kathy H., they say, she gets to pick and choose, and she always chooses her own kind. People from Halesome or one of the other privileged estates. No wonder she has a great record. I've heard it said enough, so I'm sure you've heard it plenty more. And maybe there's something in it. But I'm not the first to be allowed to pick and choose, and I doubt if I'll be the last. And anyway, I've done my share of looking after donors, brought up in every kind of place. By the time I finish, remember, I'll have done 12 years of this, and it's only for the last 6 they've let me choose. And why shouldn't they? Curs aren't machines. You try and do your best for every donor, but in the end, it wears you down. You don't have unlimited patience and energy. So when you get a chance to choose, of course, you choose your own kind. That's natural. There's no way I could have gone on for as long as I have if I'd stopped feeling for my donors every step of the way. And anyway, if I'd never started choosing, how would I have ever got close again to Ruth and Tommy after all those years? But these days, of course, there are fewer and fewer donors left who I remember, and so in practice, I haven't been choosing that much. As I say, the work gets a little harder when you don't have the deeper link with the donor. And though I'll miss being a cur, it feels just about right to be finishing at last come the end of the year. Ruth, incidentally, was only the third or fourth donor I got to choose. She already had a cur assigned to her at the time, and I remember it taking a bit of a nerve on my part, but in the end, I managed it. And the instant I saw her again at the recovery center in Dover, all our differences, while they didn't exactly vanish, seemed not nearly as important as all the other things, like the fact that we'd grown up together in Helsham, the fact that we knew and remembered things no one else did. It's ever since then, I suppose, I started seeking out for my donors people from the past, and whenever I could, people from Helsham. There have been times over the years when I've tried to leave Helsham behind, when I've told myself I shouldn't look back so much. But then there came a point when I just stopped resisting. It had to do with this particular donor I had once. In my third year as a cur, it was his reaction when I mentioned I was from Hailsham. He'd just come through his third donation. It hadn't gone well, and he must have known he wasn't going to make it. He could hardly breathe, but he looked towards me and said, Hailsham? I bet that was a beautiful place, quote unquote. Then the next morning, when I was making conversation someplace to keep his mind off of it all, and I asked where he'd grown up, he mentioned someplace in Dorset, and his face beneath the blotches went into a completely new kind of grimace. And I realized then how desperately he didn't want reminding. Instead, he wanted to hear about Helsham. So, over the next 5 or 6 days, I told him wherever he wanted to know, I should say whatever he wanted to know, and he'd lie there, all hooked up, a gentle smile breaking through. He'd ask me about the big things and the little things, about our guardians, about how we each had our own collection chest under beds, the football, the rounders, the little path that took you all around the outside of the main house, round all its nooks and crannies, the duck pond, the food, the view from the art room over the fields on a foggy morning. Sometimes he'd make me say things over and over, things I told him only the day before. He'd ask about, like, I'd never told him. Did you have a sports pavilion? Which garden was your special favorite? At first, I thought this was just the drugs, but then I realized his mind was clear enough. What he wanted was not just to hear about Hailsham, but to remember Hailsham, just like it had been in his own childhood. He knew he was close to completing, and so that was what he was doing. Getting me to describe things to him so they'd really sink in. So that maybe during those sleepless nights with the drugs and the pain and the exhaustion, the line would blur between what were my memories and what were his. That was when I first understood, really understood, just how lucky we'd been, Tommy, Ruth, me, all the rest of us. Driving around the country now, I still see things that will remind me of Hailsham. I might pass the corner of a misty field or see part of a large house in the distance as I come down the side of a valley, even a particular arrangement of poplar trees up on a hillside, and I'll think, quote, maybe this is it. I found it. This actually is Hailsham, unquote. Then I see it's impossible, and I go on driving, my thoughts drifting on elsewhere. In particular, there are those pavilions. I spot them all over the country, standing on the far side of playing fields, little white prefab buildings with a row of windows unnaturally high up, tucked almost under the eaves. I think they built a whole lot like that in the 50s and 60s, which is probably when ours was put up. If I drive past one, I keep looking over it to it for as long as possible, and one day I'll crash the car like that. But I keep doing it. Not long ago, I was driving through an empty stretch of Worcestershire and saw one beside a cricket ground so like ours of Hailstrom. I actually turned the car and went back for a second look. We loved our sports pavilion, maybe because it reminded us of those sweet little outages people always had in picture books when we were young. I can remember us back in the juniors pleading with guardians to hold the next lesson in the pavilion instead of the usual room. Then by the time we were in senior two, when we were 12, going on 13, the pavilion had become the place to hide out with your best friends when you wanted to get away from the rest of Hailsham. The pavilion was big enough to take two separate groups without them bothering each other. In the summer, a third group could hang about out on the veranda, but ideally you and your friends wanted the place just to yourselves, so there was often jockeying and arguing. The guardians were always telling us to be civilized about it, but in practice, you needed to have some strong personalities in your group to stand a chance of getting the pavilion during a break or free period. I wasn't exactly the willing type, I should say wilting type myself, but I suppose it was really because of Ruth we got in there as often as we did. Usually we just spread ourselves around the chairs and benches. There'd be five of us, six if Jenny B came along and had a good gossip. There was a kind of conversation that could only happen when you were hidden away in the pavilion. We might discuss something that was worrying us, or we might end up screaming with laughter or in a furious row. Mostly, it was a way to unwind for a while with your closest friends. On the particular afternoon I'm now thinking of, we were standing up on stools and benches, crowding around the high windows that gave us a clear view of the north playing field, where about a dozen boys from our year and senior three had gathered to play football. It was bright sunshine, but it must have been raining earlier that day because I can remember how the sun was glinting on the muddy surface of the grass. Someone said we shouldn't be so obvious about watching, but we hardly moved back at all. Then Ruth said, quote unquote, he doesn't suspect a thing. Look at him. He really doesn't suspect a thing, unquote. When she said this, I looked at her and searched for signs of disapproval about what the boys were going to do to Tommy. But the second Ruth gave a little laugh and said, quote unquote, the idiot. And I realized that for Ruth and the others, whatever the boys chose to do was pretty remote from us. Whether we approved or not didn't come into it. We were gathered around the windows at that moment, not because we relished the prospect of seeing Tommy get humiliated yet again, but just because we'd heard about this latest plot and were vaguely curious to watch it unfold. In those days, I don't think what the boys did amongst themselves went much deeper than that. For Ruth, for the others, it was that detached, and the chances are that's how it was for me too. Or maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe even then, when I saw Tommy rushing about the field, undisguised delight on his face to be accepted back in the fold again, about to play the game at which he so excelled, maybe I did feel a little stab of pain. What I do remember is that I noticed Tommy was wearing the light blue polo shirt he'd got in the sales the previous month, the one he was so proud of. I remember thinking, quote, he's really stupid playing football in that. It'll get ruined. Then how's he going to feel, unquote. Out loud, I said to no one in particular, Tommy's got his shirt on, his favorite polo shirt. I don't think anyone heard me because they were all laughing at Laura, the big clown in our group, mimicking one after the other the expressions that appeared on Tommy's face as he ran. Waved, called, tackled. The other boys were all moving around the field in that deliberately languorous way they have been when they were warming up. But Tommy, in his excitement, seemed already to be going full pelt. I said louder this time, he's going to be so sick if he ruins that shirt. This time Rush or Ruth heard me, but she must have thought I'd meant it was as some kind of joke because she laughed half heartedly, then made some quip of her own. Then the boys had stopped kicking the ball about and were standing in a pack in the mud, their cleats gently rising and falling as they waited for the team picking to start. The two captains who merged emerged were from Senior 3, though everyone knew Tommy was a better player than any of that year. They tossed for the first pick, then the one who'd won stared at the group. Look at him, someone behind me said. He's completely convinced he's going to be picked first. Just look at him. Then was something comical about Tommy at that moment. Something that made you think, well, yes, if he's going to be that daft, he deserves what's coming. The other boys were all pretending to ignore the picking process, pretending that they didn't care where they came in the order. Some were talking quietly to each other, some retying their laces, others just staring down at their feet as they trembled the mud. But Tommy was looking eagerly at the Senior 3 boy as though his name had been already called. Laura kept up her performance all through the team picking, doing all the different expressions that went across Tommy's face. The bright, eager one at the start, the puzzled concern when 4 picks had gone by and he still hadn't been chosen, the hurt and panic as it began to dawn on him that was really going on. I didn't keep glancing around at Laura, though, because I was watching Tommy. I only knew what she was doing because the others kept laughing and egging her on. Then, when Tommy was left standing alone and the boys all began sniggering, I heard Ruth say, quote, it's coming. Hold it. 7 seconds. 7, 6, 5, unquote. She never got there. Tommy burst into thunderous bellowing, and the boys, now laughing openly, started to run off towards the south playing field. Tommy took a few strides after them. It was hard to say whether his instinct was to give angry chase or if he was panicked at being left behind. In any case, he soon stopped and stood there, glaring at them, his face scarlet. Then he began to scream and shout, a nonsensical jumble of swear words and insults. We'd all seen plenty of Tommy's tantrums by then, so we came down off our stools and spread ourselves around the room. We tried to start up a conversation about something else, but there was Tommy going on in the background. And although at first we just rolled our eyes and tried to ignore it, in the end, probably a full 10 minutes after we'd first moved away, we were back at the windows again. The other boys were now completely out of view, and Tommy was no longer trying to direct his comments in any particular direction. He was just raving, flinging his limbs about at the sky and the wind and the nearest fence posts. Laura said he was maybe, quote, rehearsing his Shakespeare, unquote. Someone else pointed out how each time he screamed something, he'd raise one foot off the ground, pointing it outwards, like a, quote unquote, like a dog doing a pee, quote. Actually, I'd noticed the same foot movement myself, but what had struck me was that each time he stamped the foot back down again, flecks of mud flew up around his chins. I thought again about his precious shirt, but he was too far away from me to see if he had gotten much mud on it. Quote, I suppose that it was a bit cruel, unquote, Ruth said, the way they always work him up like that, but it's his own fault. If he'd learned to keep his cool, they'd leave him alone. They'd still keep on him, quote unquote, Hannah said. Graham K's temper's just as bad, but that only makes them all the more careful with him. The reason they go for Tommy's because he's a layabout. And everyone was talking at once about how Tommy never even tried to be creative, about how he hadn't even put anything in for the spring exchange. I suppose the truth was, by that stage, each of us was secretly wishing a guardian would come from the house.
Hello.
Even though we still have time, we should get back to that. We're going strong every time we're heading out. The house was always so dark. The time was coming to see us straight ahead, like there was no need to go anywhere near it. In any case, he was facing the other way and didn't seem courageous to offer it. At the same time, I think that one of the two of us had a great way to live. I knew this was his razors because the first response when I came up to him was to stare at me for a second and carry on as before. It was like he was doing Shakespeare and I was coming back up and stood in the middle of performance. Maybe I said, quote, "Tommy, you know, sure, you get it all mixed up until really you know something about the table." So I reached forward and put a hand on his arm. Afterwards, the others started coming into him, but I was pretty sure it was unintentional. His arms were still flailing about, and he wasn't to know I was about to put out my hand. Anyway, as he threw up his arm, he knocked my hand aside and hit the side of my face. It didn't hurt at all, but I let out a gasp, and so did most of the girls behind me. That's when at last Tommy seemed to become aware of me, of the others, and of himself, of the fact that he was there in that field behaving the way he had been and stared at me a bit stupidly. "Tommy," quote, I said quite sternly, unquote, "there is mud all over your shirt." "So what?" he mumbled, but even as he said this, he looked down and noticed the brown specks and only just stopped himself crying out in alarm. Then I saw the surprise register on his face that I should know about his feelings for the polo shirt. "It's nothing to worry about," I said, before the silence got humiliating for him. Quote, "It'll come off. If you can't get it off yourself, just take it to Miss Jody," unquote. He went on examining his shirt, then said grumpily, It's nothing to do with you anyway." He seemed to regret immediately this last remark and looked at me sheepishly, as though expecting me to say something comforting back to him, but I'd had enough of him by now, particularly with the girls watching, and for all I knew, any number of others from the windows of the main house, so I turned away with a shrug and rejoined my friends. Ruth put an arm around my shoulders as well as we walked away. "At least, quote, you got him to pipe down," unquote, she said. This was the first chapter of Never Let Me Go on Draegon Grey's variety show. Check this one out. It'll be on Spotify.